The Vietnam War and Rock Music by Caden Powell, Kyle Hulse, and Ben Russell. The rock music and culture during the Vietnam War caused people to avoid the draft by failing the medical exam, rock music going mainstream, dividing the elder from the young, changing American social dynamics, and changing political views of Americans forever. The Geneva Accords. The president of South Vietnam, Diem, wished to stay peaceful throughout their struggle. The Geneva Accords was a promise that South Vietnam would refrain from violence to keep all of Vietnam unharmed, and to keep the hope of one day Vietnam becoming free. The letter from John F. Kennedy to Ngo Dinh Diem. The letter underlines the United States' plan to help South Vietnam win the war that was just started with North Vietnam, and keep them safe. The letter also explains the United States' new beliefs about the Geneva Accords and all who oppose them. Conscription. Conscriptions were the starting point of the relationship of rock music and the Vietnam War. The first conscriptions during the Civil War had little backlash and outcry, but during the mid-20th century, Americans were starting to stand against draft laws. This is because most of the people entering the draft were young adults. In 1947, the government suggested conscription be extended to ensure peace during post-World War II. It was later extended during the Cold War to keep the military ready. During conscription, there was a medical exam that made you eligible for the draft. People would avoid the draft by acting gay to avoid military service, or raising blood pressure artificially and causing serious injuries so they would get out of the draft. Fortunate Son. The lyrics in the song Fortunate Son are saying how people were not fortunate enough to get out of the war by being the son of a senator or just not getting drafted. White Boots Marching in a Yellow Land. The lyrics in White Boots Marching in a Yellow Land are saying how during the Vietnam War, America already lost. No matter what we did, even if we did win the war, never be able to regain the trust we once had. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. In 1964, a naval encounter between the United States and North Vietnamese forces at the Gulf of Tonkin led to the passage of the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. This concluded that the United States was somehow justified in starting the war with Vietnam. The first protests. The first anti-war protest for Vietnam occurred in the spring of 1965, in which 10,000 protesters appeared in Washington, D.C. Participants at the time included veterans of the earlier movement to ban the atomic bomb, activists engaged in the civil rights movement, and folk musicians. The domino effect. America got involved with South Vietnam when they got in contact with Ngo Dinh Diem. Then they planned to fight North Vietnam, the Viet Cong. They did this because if Vietnam was overthrown by the communists in the north, they were afraid of what other countries might fall. The Tet Offensive. North Vietnamese forces launched the Tet Offensive in 1968, a series of surprise attacks that resulted in thousands of casualties on both sides. Although we managed to stop them, the Tet Offensive succeeded in crippling everyone's morale on the United States' side. More protests. Public opinion on the war started on the United States' side, but then they started to switch when more American troops were sent into Vietnam, despite growing doubts about an imminent United States victory. Anti-war radio stations. Most radio stations refused to play songs about the war due to their descriptions of the war. Strangely, the songs agreeing with the war didn't seem to get censored as much. Ballad of the Green Berets by Barry Sadler sold 2 million copies within 2 weeks of its release in March 1966, and spent 5 weeks of that year as Billboard's #1 song. This connects back to our thesis, because it shows that the war would be put in a light that did not accurately represent it. Music would be the key to justice for the war, and allow the American people to end the war using free speech. The Fall of Saigon. A year-long campaign conducted by the North Vietnamese army culminated in the capture of the South Vietnamese capital of Saigon in 1975. It was renamed Ho Chi Minh after their leader, who had died of heart failure. A large-scale evacuation of America and Vietnamese civilian and military personnel occurred after the fall of Saigon. Conclusion. In conclusion of all the things we previously stated, the rock music and culture during the Vietnam War caused people to avoid the draft by failing the medical exam, rock music going mainstream, dividing the elder from the young, changing American social dynamics, and changing political views of Americans forever.